We have to be realistic about the challenges. The challenges that are posed by Russia are far greater than the challenges that were presented as an insurgency in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan.
Oh, Russia and the perceived threat coming from the Kremlin was the top of the agenda at the G7 meeting in Toronto in Canada. Officials there described Moscow's behaviour as irresponsible and destabilising. The UK's Foreign Secretary called for joint efforts against Moscow.
What we decided was that we were going to set up a G7 group that would look at Russian malign behaviour in all its manifestations, whether it's cyber war, whether it's disinformation, assassination attempts, whatever it happens to be, and collectively try and call it out.
Right, live now to World Affairs journalist and author Neil Clark. Welcome back to RT, Neil. What's the main reason, do you think, behind the Defense Secretary Gavin Williamson in highlighting Russia as a potential global threat? What's the thinking there?
Well, it goes on and on, doesn't it? I mean, this is the real divide between the neocon establishment in Britain and the rest of the country, because Russia is not a threat. Russia is not a threat to the British people or to Britain. But it is a threat to the neocon plan for regime change in Syria. It's thwarted that, and for possible war with Iran. So that's why Russia's being demonized by these neoconservative politicians in Britain. Russia does not pose a threat to British citizens. Russia did not massacre British tourists in Tunisia in 2015. Russia didn't massacre concert goers in Manchester Arena a year ago, did it? Actually, it was forces that were actually facilitated and helped by the British government in their regime change operations. So we've got to be clear here who the threat is. The threat is actually at home. It's the British government who has been backing jihadists in Syria, so-called rebels around the world, etc. In Afghanistan, the Mujahideen back in the 80s. And it's these people who are the threat, not Russia, because Russia has done nothing wrong. It doesn't threaten British citizens, and this is all a neocon demonization campaign.
Some not very optimistic thoughts of the G7, though, on this with regards to Russia. Do you expect any action to come from that group's meeting in Canada? There's some pretty diverse thoughts there. I can't imagine the Italians necessarily agreeing with the Germans or the French or necessarily even the Japanese on this. What do you expect to happen?
What's got to happen, Colin, is for other countries to actually stand up now and make their voices loudly heard about this. It can't be right that Britain and America are going around trying to bully other countries in Europe, particularly against their own financial best interest, to actually increase sanctions on Russia or to treat Russia as an enemy. Europe wants better links with Russia. It wants the sanctions to be lifted. European business wants that. And that's the message that came out of the Yalta Forum last week, which I attended, the Yalta International Economic Forum, where we had visitors to Russia from over 400 people from, I think, over 60 countries. The message was loud and clear. These countries in Europe, which are unhappy about this, have got to stand up now and make their voices heard. They've got to represent their own people and not allow themselves to be bullied by countries like the US and the UK. So I think that the other G7 countries now have got to stand up for themselves a bit more, and the same with the EU, where we've got countries like Austria, who I know are critical about the sanctions. Countries should come together now and say to the US and UK, no, we don't want any more of this ratcheting up with a Cold War with Russia. We actually want to see sanctions lifted, and that would be good for European business and good for European jobs. And so I think it's about time these countries stood up for themselves a bit more.
Right. Well, what if all the G7 do end up on the same page? We're still talking about a block of powerful countries, and the EU is a powerful entity. If that happens, then what harm might that do to the anti-terror efforts in the Middle East?
It's going to do enormous harm, isn't it? Because who is fighting? Who has been fighting ISIS? Who's played the pivotal role in defeating ISIS in Syria? It's been Russia. Who has been the country that has actually done more to defeat or try and defeat the sort of groups, jihadist groups, whose people, whose followers were committing terrorist acts in Britain? Well, it's been Russia, not the British government. The British government is intervening in Syria against a government backed by Russia that is fighting these jihadists. So it's quite absurd, this situation. And as you said, if this anti-Russian campaign continues, then the victims are going to be those people under threat from the jihadists. So I think it's time that the people in Britain made their voices very loudly heard on this one, to say enough is enough. An end to this Russophobia. We want to see a lifting of sanctions on Russia. But unfortunately, we're going the opposite way. The government is pushing this more and more, I'm afraid. And, I came back to England from Russia on Sunday night on the plane, and we were met by customs staff asking Russians and British people on that plane, why did you go to Russia? Why are you coming to Britain? It's quite appalling. That's Russophobia at the moment. That's coming from above. That's coming from the British government. And I think we've all got to say enough's enough now on this and make our voices even more loudly heard.
Yeah, whichever way you look at it, we're a long way from Russian-Western relations getting anywhere near back on track, aren't we? All right, for now, Neil Clark, World Affairs journalist, thanks very much for talking to us again.